I think like the big challenge for startups is not like how do we stay nimble so we can be actively engaged in ongoing conflicts that pop up over time. And I think this is the way a lot of like drone companies have been thinking about Ukraine, as they're like, yeah, we're like selling stuff. We're like, throwing drones over the wall to Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine's going to buy whatever they can to like be credible in this conflict. The question is, how can you have something deployed at scale in production before the conflict happens, so that when it does happen, you're deploying relevant capabilities, not 30-year-old capabilities.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Defense Tech Underground podcast. In today's episode, we interview Anduril co-founder and Founders Fund partner, Trae Stevens. I'm your host, Jeff Vanoff, and my co-host is Josh Pickering.
In today's episode, we discuss Trae Stevens' early career with Congressman Rob Portman, his time at the embassy in Afghanistan, his contributions at Palantir, the founding of Anduril, and the future of defense technology.
Trae Stevens is the co-founder and executive chairman of Anduril Industries and a partner at Founders Fund. He focuses on startups operating in the government space, leveraging his extensive background in data analysis and enterprise solutions. Trae's innovative approach has significantly impacted both Silicon Valley and the defense industry, making him a key player in bridging these two worlds.
You are listening to the Defense Tech Underground, where we explore the intersection of technology and national security. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Gordian Knott Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford and sponsored by Rhombus Power, providing decision advantage to the national security enterprise. And now, Trae Stevens.
Trae Stevens, thank you so much for joining us on the Defense Tech Underground.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Now, Trae, you had a unique background amongst defense tech or tech people in Silicon Valley. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like growing up for you and how that started you on your path?
I grew up in kind of rural Ohio, off of Interstates I-71 between Cincinnati and Columbus, in the middle of the woods, in a log home that my dad built with his bare hands. So, yes, definitely not, sitting in a coastal seat of power. I think like most people that went to a public school in the middle of the American Midwest, I definitely was raised with a sense of appreciation for the country, and for the freedoms that I had. But I don't think I really had like internalized that as like a motivating kind of mission factor that was going to determine what my career was going to be like until 9/11 happened. So I was a senior in high school when on September 11th, and kind of reframed my picture for what I wanted to do as a career. I, at the time, thought I wanted to be a journalist, like a kind of an international correspondent. I was super interested in like international affairs and stuff. When that happened, I decided that I really wanted to work in service to the country in some way, and explored different pathways for what that might look like, and settled on having an interest in working in the civilian side of the national security community. The rest is kind of history.
Trae, we heard that you fought your way to Georgetown. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So I guess picking up from where I just left off, I applied to a bunch of schools that I thought would be good feeders into the defense and intelligence community. And, it's like predictable places like Harvard, Duke, Cornell, stuff like that. And I ended up getting rejected basically everywhere. And, I remember getting all the skinny envelopes in April of my senior year, and sitting on my couch, just like totally defeated. And my mom challenged me, and she said, Trae, where do you want to go to school? I was like, well, Georgetown's my first choice. It's still the place I want to go. She's like, all right, you're going to get on a plane, you're going to fly to Washington, D.C., and you're going to tell them that you're going to school there. It seemed like a pretty crazy idea at the time, but, I trusted my mom. So I went with a backpack full of additional recommendation letters from, a litany of people who I'm sure Georgetown wouldn't care to read a recommendation letter from anyway. Demanded to see the dean of admissions. And to my surprise, that they actually met with me, and they said, look, this is a stunt. It's a crazy stunt. But if we don't fill out the class, you're at the top of the waiting list, and you'll get a spot. And to my surprise, a few weeks later, they got a call from the admissions office while I was in an AP test, actually, and ended up getting in. So it was a pretty kind of crazy turn of events that I did not expect was going to happen, but ended up changing the course of my career. I think like the thing that's like so crazy about this story is that, as an 18-year-old, you're expected to have the foresight to understand how this single decision is going to dramatically change your trajectory in life.
And then after college, you went to work on the Hill for then Congressman Portman. Did you work on the defense portfolio there? What was that experience like?
No, quite the opposite. I worked on the help Rob transition to the U.S. trade rep role portfolio, which included me sitting in a storage room making copies of form letters and documenting in a spreadsheet his 12-year congressional record in storage boxes. It was not the most fun job. And if you were to ask Rob today, he would get a kick out of telling you the same story out of me sitting in the Cannon building in storage rooms by myself, sweating. But I was waiting for a clearance, so I had no alternative.
Oh, that's wild. Now, after that, you went to work at the Afghan embassy to the U.S. For the Karzai government. Is that right?
That was actually while I was in college. So during the time, Georgetown had a close relationship with the Karzai family and the several players in the transitional government. And when they decided to, post-Taliban, the U.S. agreed to reopen the embassy, which had been abandoned, by the way, when the Taliban had taken control, decades prior. And so the embassy was just total trash. Like, I mean, flip tables, papers all over the floor. And that all happened kind of pre-computer. And so coming back into the embassy and saying, we need to establish a new diplomatic mission that in this abandoned embassy building was quite an undertaking. And so Georgetown kind of volunteered me to go and work at the embassy. And a lot of what I did early on was like, it was kind of IT. It's like getting computers set up, making sure that we had stationery, letterhead, templates for PowerPoint, that we had a good Excel spreadsheet for tracking visas. I mean, it was a lot of IT work. And then over time, I ended up interning there for probably close to about 3 years. Over time, that transitioned more to the political affairs side of the embassy, where I got to do like build briefing books and work on legislative agendas and things like that, which was super, super cool and rewarding. But it was all just kind of tied into Georgetown's relationship with the Afghan people and what was happening in the transition.
Wow. And I guess, 20 plus years later, we can look back and see how that endeavor in nation building in Afghanistan turned out. But at the time, did you have a sense of how the war was going, what the prospects were for this future or new Afghan government?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it ever felt like things were on this incredibly positive track. I think nation building is really hard, and there's a lot that you can do as an occupying force, I guess, to like ensure that certain things are happening. But at the end of the day, like what we were asking for the Middle East at the time was to fast forward 500 years of Enlightenment philosophy into a tiny window. And like, if we're not going to sit there and make sure that people do what we say that they should do to have a democratic government, like, I'm just not sure that was ever a particularly rational perspective.
So we have Georgetown. You're working in DC. How does this part of your early career orient you to Silicon Valley and then eventually defense? What was that transition?
Yeah. I think I had expected in some way that working inside the government would like be super missional, and I would just wake up every day and feel so excited to like go and tackle these important problems. And there was an aspect of it that was like that, but there was also an aspect of it that was, abject horror at the bureaucracy and how difficult it would be to get anything done. And we didn't have like supercomputers at our fingertips, and we weren't handed the keys to an Aston Martin and, given this, self-exploding cassette tape or anything like that. It was like, a CRT monitor and Windows 98, that sort of engagement. And so about 2.5 years in, I saw a demo of Palantir, and it's like, wow, this would save me so much time. Like my day-to-day would be so different if I had access to something like this. But try as I might, there was no real path to making that happen. So I ended up leaving and joining Palantir very, very early on. Like the company was more or less pre-revenue, and had this really incredible 6 years of working at Palantir, kind of unpacking how to do business with the government. What are the difficulties with convincing someone to acquire software licenses rather than pursue multi-year development programs and requirements documents and white papers. And it took us a long time to figure that out. And once we did, it was, things worked pretty well, and we were able to scale fairly rapidly. And, the government is a huge chunk of Palantir's revenue today, and it's, $40+ billion market cap company. So like things ultimately ended up going really well, but it was slow going in the early days. And I think that kind of like is what set me down this path of trying to figure out where there are other areas where there are massive inefficiencies in the government that need to be addressed, not only because they can be addressed and there's an economic incentive to doing so, but because it's important to the taxpayer, it's important to the warfighter, it's important to the people that are trying to carry out this mission without the tools that they need to be successful. And that's like it's a really motivational kind of aspect of what I do, not only at Anduril, but also in looking at other GovTech companies in my role at Founders Fund.
So you experienced the frustration of the government's adoption of technology from the government side, and decided to go and try to do it anyways on the private side. Are there any stories from the early days at Palantir of how you figured out go to market, how you figured out selling software to government?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you have to be a consummate outsider in order to recruit and retain talent, to come up with creative solutions to complicated problems, to there's like all of these outsider aspects, but then you can't really play that game on the acquisitions front. Like you have to be a consummate insider to figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy. And I think oftentimes early on at Palantir, we were just so focused on being an outsider that we couldn't really figure out all of the inside baseball that we needed to be successful. And so at Anduril, we hired a lobbyist in the first week the business existed. And that's all predicated on lessons that we learned at Palantir in the time that I was there. We started a government relations motion. We started trying to get language into the National Defense Authorization Act. We built relationships with the decision makers that were ultimately going to be buying things rather than the end users of those products that are naturally easier to sell to, in quotes. And so I think it was just like a lot of lessons learned about, where you apply pressure and how that pressure is different when the end user, the buyer, and the appropriator of funds to the buyer are all different people. That's generally not the case in traditional commercial enterprise.
Yeah, Trae, what were the biggest roadblocks that you faced in trying to sell Palantir to the government for the first time?
Oh man, there are so many. I think this outsider insider thing is an important piece. I think another important piece is the, requirements driven process versus a product driven process. There was a lawsuit that was very public around the distributed common ground system platform, and kind of Title 10 USC 2377, which is this law that says there's a commercial preference in acquisitions. So you can't build something from scratch that exists to buy commercially. And like, who gets held accountable for that? Like, is it possible to just overscope requirements so that there isn't a commercial product that meets enough of the requirement to trigger Title 10 USC 2377? And ultimately, the federal courts sided with Palantir and said you can't intentionally overscope to eliminate commercial options. And I don't think that like there's malintented people necessarily working in these decision-making positions, but I do think that like the incentives aren't particularly well aligned to deliver capabilities rapidly to the warfighter and do it in an economically efficient way. And so we were just trying to navigate that tension. Like, how do you figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't make so many enemies that it's impossible to operate? And at Anduril, we've had the benefit of like, we kind of knew how to do that early on. And so we avoided making so many enemies. But at Palantir, it was tough. It was like we were constantly trying to figure out like how we could smooth things over from making mistakes, from, pricing in ways that were very difficult for people to understand, from, going to Congress to try to get answers to things that people felt like was going over their head. There's like all of these really challenging dynamics. And I think oftentimes for a lot of startups, especially that are trying to do business here, they think of this not as like a complicated go-to-market motion. They think of it as the field of dreams. It's like, if I build this product, the customer will come. But anyone who's worked in this space for any meaningful amount of time knows that this is ridiculous. Like, you could build a perpetual motion machine and go to the DoD and they're going to be like, we have no requirement for a perpetual motion machine. And by the way, if we did, we would scope the requirements as such that your perpetual motion machine wouldn't be exactly the one that we need, so that we would go and give Lockheed Martin $2 billion to build it from scratch, even though you have an existing product that you could deploy today. It's just like the incentives don't really work. And so it's kind of irrational and naive to believe that you could just build something and the customer will show up with money to buy it. And we've kind of avoided that naive mentality in our swing at Anduril.
Now, Trae, if you could wave a magic wand and fix some of the ways that procurement and acquisition actually goes, what would you do? What would be your first priorities?
There's a long list of things that, like, if I were king for a day, I would probably try to do. I think the first thing is that for a certain set of capability, which, by the way, I will say this, the government has started doing some of this stuff. And so I think culturally, there has been a bit of a shift. There's this like bridging capabilities fund that King Calvert's office pushed through that provides funding for, transitioning tech out of like research and development and into production capabilities. I think the Replicator initiative is another great example of like leaning much more heavily into non-traditionals for building some of these highly scaled attritable platforms. DIU has done a great job of facilitating transition. So I think there's momentum. So I don't want to suggest in saying any of this that there aren't people that are thinking about the culture change. But I think the first thing that I would do if I were king for a day is I would really reiterate the importance of the culture change. And I would just say, like, look, for some capabilities, the types of people that we need access to pull this off credibly do not exist in our traditional providers. It just doesn't exist. If you go back to the Cold War and you're like, I want to build the world's fastest airplane that can travel at altitudes over, 60,000 feet. And I'm going to have to develop like a new type of jet fuel in order to get this plane to work. And it needs to be stealth and blah, 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 blah. It's like, where is the pocket of people that can do all of those things and actually deliver something to me on a timeline that's relevant? The answer was obvious. It was Skunkworks. That was the only place in the world where the most talented people went to do these things. The problem is today we look at this and we say, we want super low cost, autonomous systems that can swarm, that have like next generation command and control, that do target, like self-identification, target selection, that use artificial intelligence to, allow us to scale more rapidly in the battlefield. Like all these capabilities, most of them are software capabilities. And you say, like, where am I going to get access to the talent to do that? You can't honestly tell me that, like, the traditional primes are the answer to that question. Like the talent is at, Google optimizing ads or something. It's like, it's not at the primes. And so I think that we just have to think differently about aspirationally where the people that we need to accomplish this mission are actually located professionally. And there's probably all sorts of ways that you can do that with, like, you know, kind of the way that Replicator handled this, where we're just going to pick a set of capabilities. We're going to allocate funding to those capabilities, and we're going to intentionally go out and ask industry to respond to this that are not necessarily the traditionals. And then I think this is reflected in all sorts of different ways. Like, one of the kind of more controversial things, I believe, is that as the due to the way that the world has transitioned digitally, there's a much higher importance for signals intelligence than there ever has been before. Like, if you think about what happened on October 7th, like, man, that was a huge SIGINT failure for the Israeli intelligence community. And it's only going to be more and more important for us to be good at this. And yet, the NSA is probably, like, at its worst place from a talent perspective in its history, partly because of the Snowden Accords, what happened with Snowden, partly because of just like a talent exodus of engineers from national security jobs, partly because it's a massive bureaucracy. It's not a fun place to work, whatever it might be. But I actually think that if I were king for a day, I would split NSA out from Cybercom, and I would put a politically appointed civilian in charge of the NSA, and I would make sure that the director of the agency is someone that can recruit talent. And I don't think these are the right people. Like, imagine how different the agency would be if, like, Jack Dorsey or Elon Musk was the director of the NSA. Like, the level of talent you would be able to get in this, like, critical mission. But it's not. It's a 4-star general who is, no one even knows what their name is. The engineers that you would need to recruit would not be motivated or inspired to work for them. And we just assume that this is okay. And it's not okay. That is, like, it would make a world of difference to change that.
We saw with Project Maven that there are a lot of people in tech who are uncomfortable with working in defense. What case would you make for top tier tech talent to choose to work for either defense tech companies or to go into government?
I don't think there is as much opposition to this idea of working on defense tech as the activists would like for you to believe. The Project Maven thing, which was a long time ago, by the way, 6 years ago or whatever, pre-Ukraine, pre-Israel, there were, like, 5,000 people that signed that letter. There are 100,000 people that work at Google. Well, maybe 200,000 people. It's like a tiny percentage of the population that works there. If you think about, like, the distribution of talent as a Gaussian distribution, like a normal distribution curve, a bell curve, you have people on one side that are, like, highly patriotic. They, like, really want to work on things that are kind of working on the national security mission. Most of those people, they already work in defense tech. They work at Palantir, they work at SpaceX, they work at Anduril, whatever. You have people on the other side of that, which are, like, the 5,000 people that signed the letter at Google. It's, Meredith Whittaker at Signal, whatever. They're just never going to work on this. It's like they're opposed to it for whatever ethical reasons they've invented in their heads, and that's fine. You don't have to work in defense. This is the beauty of democracy without civil military fusion. Like, you have the right to do whatever you want. If you want to go optimize ads and make monkey JPEGs, like, you can do that. That's fine. Go do it. There's that whole, like, middle of that bell curve that is, people who are not, super pumped about, working in national security. They're also not super amped about complaining about people that work in national security. They're just engineers that could be convinced one way or another. And we don't spend enough time talking to them because we're so reactionary, just, like, pointing at both of the, like, tails of the distribution curve. And so I found that, like, if you can sit down with someone and answer their hard questions, talk to them about just war theory and ethics, and describe the importance of the mission, like, they're going to be convinced. And I think that's, like, 85% of the total, pool of potential talent. So I'm not terribly concerned about that.
On capturing that human capital, hopefully some of our audience or future defense tech Founders Fund is different from most VCs. Can you talk about why?
Yeah, I mean, I think the principal thing that's probably worth discussing here, that's pertinent to this question around defense tech founders, is that we don't category invest. Chapter 3 of Peter's book 0 to 1 is entitled "Competition is for Losers," and I think like people believe that once a category is hype, that you should just run at the hype. But this doesn't actually correlate with returns at all. If you were a space tech investor and you didn't invest in SpaceX, you probably lost money. If you were a social media investor and you didn't invest in Facebook, you probably lost money. If you're a crypto investor and you didn't invest in Bitcoin or Coinbase, you probably lost money. If you were a sharing economy investor, you didn't invest in Uber or Airbnb, you probably lost money. You're a VR investor, you didn't invest in Oculus, you probably lost money. And so like, hype is not correlated with, category returns. It turns out that there's usually like an N of one type of generational company that emerges in each of these categories. And so I think like, the Founders Fund approach to this is like, we want to invest in generational businesses. We want to invest in like these world changing companies. And so, yeah, we're, the largest, if not one of the largest, if not the largest institutional shareholder in SpaceX, Palantir, and Anduril during venture stages. Obviously, Palantir's public now. But that doesn't mean that we're like trolling around, like just looking to throw cash at every defense company that comes along, because I actually think this is really hard. It's like, you're doing startups on God mode. I think people need to be more generally aware of that, but I think certainly be aware of that and interacting with Founders Fund. So we're not dogmatic about much, but that is probably like the thing that we are most dogmatic about is that we aren't super interested in highly competitive market spaces. The other thing is like we're kind of founder fundamentalists. We don't invest in non-founder CEO companies led by non-founder CEOs. We generally don't take board seats. We have probably board seats on around 5% or less of our portfolio. We don't vote against founders. We don't fire founders. We want founders to have control of their businesses. We also, as a result, don't think that we're going to be the thing that make the difference between the company being successful and not successful. If I feel like my help is going to be super critical to a company's success, well, then I should have started the company. Like, why am I investing in it? Investors are not central to the narrative of a company being successful. So I think there are like all these like different ways in which Founders Fund is a highly unique place. But those are probably the two that are most relevant to founders as they are thinking about fundraising.
What experiences, either yours or the other folks at Founders Fund, led to this philosophy that's so founder-centric?
I mean, this is pure Peter. Peter is the CEO of the fund. He's the founder of the fund. He has experienced this many times over with several very successful startups, obviously, with PayPal, with Palantir. He, philosophically speaking, has recognized that competition breeds violence. And this is, you can go back. If you want to get into Peter's head, you can go and read René Girard, who's a philosopher, theologian who taught at Stanford for several decades. And this was kind of the core idea is mimetic theory. This idea that people don't fight because they're different. They fight over similarities. And, as humans, we have this like highly competitive instinct that causes us to like run into these competitive moments when actually the most interesting things that happen are the ones that are the most different. It's, this is where the whole like meme around, contrarian thought comes from and stuff like that. It's all rooted in this idea that like doing things that are popular is actually, it's like on its surface, the way to be cool. But in actuality, like doing things that are popular is just like a recipe for failure.
Can you talk about your Founders Fund matrix, the importance of being early and being right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there's the category, if you think about like a quad chart where you have like right and wrong, as in like economically it did well or it didn't, and then contrarian or non-contrarian. Founders Fund loves being in the contrarian and right quadrant. That is like our sweet spot. The problem is that there are also super consensus bets that end up being right. And these are like, enterprise SaaS, like B2B SaaS companies and stuff like that. And it sucks to be, non-consensus and wrong or consensus and wrong. Like you ultimately want to be in the two right quadrants, whether it's consensus or non-consensus. But I think a lot of funds are almost entirely focused on consensus and right. And I don't think that there aren't infinite opportunities there. If you look at the most valuable companies, private companies in the world today, Founders Fund is invested in most of them. And most of them were very original ideas when they were started. There wasn't like a market of companies that existed in the sector they're in. They ended up being the generational companies that defined a sector. And the ones that we miss are usually the ones that are much more consensus companies that yes, they ended up working, but there was nothing novel or original about it when it was started necessarily.
Now, there's been a lot of hype about defense technology over the last couple of years. Do you think this is a defense tech bubble, or do you think this is renewed attention to the sector that's much needed?
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think it's possible that both are true. I think it's really good that the sector is getting more attention now. When we started Anduril in 2017, it was like highly unusual to find a company in the defense space. Now there's a bunch, and hopefully some of those work, and that ends up being really good for the warfighter. It ends up being good for the taxpayer. But I also think it's like pretty overhyped, and valuations are creeping out to like near AI category levels, which doesn't feel super sustainable. And so I think that that investors have a role in this. Like they're kind of playing into the hysteria. But founders also have a role in it. It's like if you want your company to exist in 5 years, you probably need to be thinking about like what hurdles you're setting for yourself to jump over, especially if there's some sort of macro correction.
Moving from these general categories and also your time at Palantir, can you now talk to us about the founding of Anduril?
So yeah, when I first joined Founders Fund, I didn't know anything about venture. Like I had spent my entire career in either government service or on the software sales side of the house. And so in trying to learn about venture, I decided to spend some time getting spun up on a category that I felt I did understand reasonably well, which was this defense technology space. And so I started meeting with every company I could find that was doing anything with the federal government. Not just national security related, it's like literally any civic tech thing that I could come across. And didn't really find anything that was high conviction enough to get through the process at Founders Fund. We made one investment in a company called Expanse that was renamed KDM that ended up getting acquired by Palo Alto Networks for $1 billion. So we made one investment that ended up being pretty good, but didn't really find anything else. And so I went back to the team and I kind of told them this sob story about how I had spent 2 years like meeting with every company that I could. And what I was really looking for was like Stark Industries from Iron Man, but no one was building that company. And to my surprise, the team challenged me on that and said, well, it sounds like you have a conviction around an idea. Why don't you just go and start that company? Which was not something I thought I was allowed to do. I thought I was being compensated to be a venture capital investor. But we were the first investor in Oculus. So Palmer and I had been friends for a while. I knew that Palmer was interested in national security as well. And so I kind of went and had lunch with Palmer and pitched this idea to him, like, hey, what if we started this company? And he kind of laughed and said, I love the idea. That sounds really fun, but I've committed my life to VR and I'm here at Facebook trying to like make this thing into a reality. And so I just kept peppering him every couple of months, like, hey, if you ever decide that you want to leave Facebook to start another company, like we need to do this Stark Industries thing together. And towards the end of 2016, he reached back out to me and he was like, yo, I'm going to get fired for my politics. Where are you on the Stark Industries thing? And so he and I started jamming on this, and then sure enough, Zuck did what Zuck did, which is now a part of recorded history that everyone knows about. And so Palmer and I kind of set off down this path, and he brought along his the first employee from Oculus, Joe Chen, and I grabbed my two closest friends who were on the exec team at Palantir, Matt Grimm and Brian Schimpf, and they came over and we hashed this kind of crazy journey to build a next generation defense product focused defense contractor.
Can you tell us about what Anduril is doing, in a world of electronic warfare solutions, being regularly applied to drones. You are building kinetic responses. You're building hardware, moving from the software of Palantir. Where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, I mean, one of the lessons that we learned at Palantir is that it's really, really hard to sell software to the government. They don't know how to value it. They feel like the margins are extractive. They basically think that like, any monkey with a computer science degree can like sit down and build world-class software, which is why they have like software factories all over the government. They're like, we're going to teach airmen how to code, and then we're going to build Palantir. It's like, no, you're not. This is not going to work. So that ended up being a real impediment to growth. And they do know how to buy hardware. This is a motion that the DoD goes through frequently. And so the question was, how do you get what they really, really need, which is this autonomy stack, in the door? And the way to do that is you bend the metal around it, and then you sell them the metal. And it's kind of like a Trojan horse almost. And so that was kind of the early strategy that panned out. And I think, it's obviously still not easy, but having the ability to like build these end-to-end platforms and then ship those end-to-end platforms and see the direct impact is a much better strategy. On the other side, the other thing that's like worth mentioning about our strategy, we've gotten a lot of heat for this. I think it was Bloomberg that ran an annoying headline that said like, Anduril is going to build weapons, and they included some quote for me where I said, "There's no confusion when you join Anduril, you're signing up to build weapons." I think the clarity is important. If you go back, as you referenced in the prior question, if you go back to the Project Maven story, I think part of what the activists were saying was not like we're opposed to working in defense. It was, you didn't tell us we were going to do this. Like, we've been building capabilities that are being repurposed for defense purposes, and we didn't get a vote on that. And I think companies have to be really careful with this, especially the big tech companies, because they have an employee base filled with people who, they signed up to like, optimize ads and build enterprise productivity suites. And you can't just like, pull down the curtain and say like, surprise, you're like doing object identification and drone imagery for predator strikes. It's like, they really don't like that. And so I think at Anduril, we've taken the opposite approach, which is to say like, are you going to build things that explode? Yes. Are you going to build things that have lethal potential? Yes. Are you going to integrate weapons payloads that are developed at the U.S. Army munition centers? Yes. Are you going to build loitering munitions? Yes. Are you going to participate in command and control for active combat? Yes. And so, I think when people come to us and they're like, what is it that you guys are comfortable doing? It's like, we'll just tell you. We're just gonna be very open with you. Like, yes, we are going to build things that you would classify as weapons. And if somebody's like, I don't want to build weapons, it's like, okay, fine. You don't have to work here. Like, I think that there are enough people out there that hear this and they're like, yeah, it turns out we need kinetics. We need to build things that have deterrent potential. And many of the things that have deterrent potential are lethal. And just being honest with that, I think, gives us a lot more leverage.
We saw the news break yesterday that Founders Fund is co-leading Anduril's next fundraise, something like a $14 billion valuation. Can you talk about what's next for Anduril and what the future holds?
Yeah. Many of these things have been publicly reported, so I'm not really like dropping anything that would be terribly surprising. But at the end of April, we were awarded the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, which is the autonomous fighter plane. And that's something that we need to, develop and scale very rapidly. Same thing with our dive contract with the Australian Navy. So we're building these like school bus sized autonomous submarines. It was also just announced that the United States is sending large quantities of Altia 600M loitering munitions to Taiwan. So, you could come up with like a list of all of these things that are like, not like we're being paid to build an aircraft carrier. And it's like, in 15 years, Anduril is going to like open the doors to a shipyard and you're going to see a Ford class aircraft carrier roll out into the water. It's like, no, these are massive quantities of attritable systems. So a core focus of the business at this point is will continue to be on developing new products, moving really fast. Like that will always be part of our DNA. But there's also a part of our DNA that's kind of like more like a scaled commercial automaker. Like we need to build a huge factory that can kind of print and deploy hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of units of autonomous systems that the customer is interested in buying at scale as quickly as possible. And so we have a massive internal effort that's really built around scaling our manufacturing capability. And that will be a core part of what we will be up to for the next couple of years.
So the world is facing a conflict in Ukraine. Things are heating up in the Middle East. Many are concerned about the possibility of an Indo-PACOM conflict. It sounds like the answer is these mass building efforts you're describing. How do you view the role of Anduril and other defense tech companies in these conflicts?
Yeah, so you don't go into a modern conflict with the technology of tomorrow or even of today. You go into these conflicts with whatever you have in inventory. And so it turns out that like in the early days of the Ukraine war, it's like, what are we sending them? We're sending them Javelins, Stingers, HIMARS, Gimlers, Patriots. These are like 30-plus-year-old technologies, and it's just what we had in inventory. And in 18 months, we blew through 15 years of acquired inventory. And if we were to go into a hot conflict with China over Taiwan or whatever, like in 4 weeks, we're done. Like we have nothing left. Our munitions supply has been completely depleted. And so I think like the big challenge for startups is not like, how do we stay nimble so we can be actively engaged in ongoing conflicts that pop up over time? And I think this is the way a lot of like drone companies have been thinking about Ukraine, as they're like, yeah, we're like selling stuff. We're like, throwing drones over the wall to Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine's going to buy whatever they can to like be credible in this conflict. The question is, how can you have something deployed at scale in production before the conflict happens, so that when it does happen, you're deploying relevant capabilities, not 30-year-old capabilities? And so that's really what we're focused on. I'm less concerned about being like in the minute responsive to these conflicts by like building new capabilities that specifically address challenges they're facing in theater, although of course that will be a part of what happens. The real question is, how can we be the stockpile of inventory that's required to deter conflict, but also is required to, execute our strategy when things do happen in the future.
On a macro level, in prior interviews, you've talked about an Operation Paperclip 2.0 to get TSMC scientists onshored. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, one of the funniest tweets that I've read in like the last 3 years was, I don't even know who posted it, but he said something along the lines of, I'm really looking forward to the biopic in 20 years about that one time I left TSMC engineers off the roof of their headquarters when China was invading. I'm also looking forward to that biopic. It feels like that is fairly likely to happen in the next 3 to 4 years. So we'll see how that goes down. I think that the challenge is that knowledge is part of it for sure. Like we don't really have the domestic supply of semiconductor lithography kind of skills that we would need to build, the high end sub 5 nanometer chips or whatever that are going to be required to power consumer devices and military technology into the future. So yes, I believe that is a challenge, but there's also a big infrastructure piece of this that is a massive challenge as well. You can't just like stand up a TSMC comparable chips factory in like 6 months. Like these things take a long time. Obviously, this is what the CHIPS Act is all about: is funding national scale projects to onshore at least some of that. Although it seems like a lot of our early work is more in the like 7, 10, 12 nanometer range rather than the really small stuff that's being used in the cutting edge consumer devices. But onshoring some of that, I think, is part of the CHIPS Act strategy. We'll see how much of the itch that scratches, I guess.
Much like Anduril's origin story, what are you looking at out there that you wish was being built in national security technology that no one's building yet?
Yeah, I mean, if I had clever answers to that, it would just be Anduril's product lines, because that's where we'd be spending our time and effort. There are some places where I think there are like open questions about how international law is going to shape around the use of artificial intelligence, or even like the use of kinetics in space. I think that's come up several times. One of the common science fiction tropes of future warfare is rods from God, which is like tungsten rods with some very dumb guidance systems being dropped out of satellites. I think, there's all sorts of stuff like that like you can envision would have a tremendous deterrent impact, but there's all sorts of questions that need to be worked out with international law and not escalating arms races and stuff like that. So I'm not sure I have a really clever answer other than like, go check out www.anduril.com.
Always selling, Trae. Always selling. I love it.
Always be selling.
You've talked about lessons you've learned at Palantir, then applied to Anduril, not only in the narrative, waiting too long to get lobbyists on the ground. For these future founders, are there other key lessons you would want them to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it goes to this, like the intersection with the investor community, which is that the optimal outcome of any fundraise is not the highest price you can possibly raise money at. You like everything that you do from an investor relations perspective is a step in your path, and you need to be able to like set yourself up for success at the next step as well. And so, I think a lot of founders went into like 2020, 2021 with this feeling like, cash is basically free. Like everything's really easy. I can go out and raise as much money as I want in really non-dilutive ways, and I should just do that. And then what ended up happening is that, they're years later, they're still not caught up, and the fundraising environment has gotten really cold. And they're having to do like weird structure in their financings. They're having to do recaps. They're having to like, true people up on true their employees up as they're repricing their options. I mean, it's like, it's just not worth it. And so I think like, we should be leaning into this moment where there is more money floating around that is interested in going towards national security problems, but just be reasonable. And try to keep in mind that like you should be setting the company up with the thought that something from a macro perspective might go wrong at some point in the future, not that like it's just going to be up and to the right forever.
So let's double click on that a bit more. The three new quote unquote primes, Anduril, Palantir, and SpaceX, were all started by billionaires. What does this mean for future founders in defense tech?
Having a billionaire co-founder is really handy. It's a tremendous de-risker for the capital environment, because they know that, if Elon shows up and dumps $150 million into SpaceX to get it to its next stage, then, that's a risk that the investors don't have to take. And so unfortunately, I think over the last 20 years, this has been like kind of a weird prerequisite. Like you've almost had to have that because the government acquisition process has been so harrowing that they like accidentally created a Howard Hughes model for entrepreneurship instead of a startup garage model. I think this is bad for the country. I think it's bad for taxpayers. I think it's bad for the warfighter. And I think that's starting to shift a little bit. I'm not necessarily as convinced as I was 7 years ago that having a billionaire co-founder is a necessary component. But you should keep that in mind. Like I think a lot of times founders will think about this from a founding perspective as like, do you have to be a serial entrepreneur? Do you have to have like all this experience? Like, what is it that Elon has that I don't have? And like, I'm just as smart, or I have just as good of a team. I just don't think that that's actually the thing that anyone in the investor community is saying. I think they're purely talking about financial de-risking. It's like, yeah, you might be really smart, but do you have $150 million to save the company if things start going wrong? If the answer is no, then I don't really care how smart you are. That's not what any of this is about. So I think it's all just like a de-risking kind of game.
So tactically, what would you recommend for future founders or folks that are interested in defense tech that may not have everything fully worked out yet?
I think there's tremendous value in going and working at a place where it's working. If you look at the Palantir mafia, kind of like all the companies that have come out of Palantir, it's actually remarkable. Like there are a dozen unicorns that have come out of Palantir, which is very cool. Anduril has had a number of successful companies that have been spun out by Anduril alums. I think there's just a lot of value in kind of learning by being close to the fire. The other kind of perspective on this is that if you're starting a defense tech company and you have like the kind of the technical edge, you have a great product idea, you have all the engineers that you would need to pull that off, you should think about how you're going to handle the go-to-market side of the equation. And I've seen a lot of companies, like really, really good engineering companies, great product companies that have gone and hired people that have worked very closely inside the big three new defense companies, whether it's SpaceX, Palantir, or Anduril. And I think that can be a successful pathway as well. But you just need to think about like all of the aspects of the business and try to make sure that you have like the fullness of that covered, rather than, again, just going in and believing that it's the field of dreams.
Trey, what's a book that every defense tech founder should read?
Skunk Works by Ben Rich. It's incredible. It's kind of a history of what happened in the Cold War at Skunk Works that is not only incredibly inspirational, but it's also a call to arms.
That's great. And for those in our audience, future engineers, potential founders who are thinking about founding either in defense tech or working elsewhere, why should they consider building in the service to the nation?
I mean, I have a tricky answer to that, which is that maybe they shouldn't. I think that, mission matters a lot. Like, this is why in Silicon Valley, and I mean the HBO show, not the geography, there's, a constant ongoing meme of making fun of people for saying that they're making the world a better place with whatever their stupid startup is. Like people are looking for meaning, and there's an incredible mission in what we're doing in the national security space from a tech perspective. And that's motivating. It makes recruiting talent easier. It makes coming into work and being excited about it every day much easier. And I think that's an incredible positive. That said, at the same time, if you're just doing it because you want to be part of the meme, I would encourage you to not do it, because that's not a very compelling origin story. And so you should have a good reason for doing whatever it is that you're doing that's not just pure validation.
Trae, speaking about having a good reason, some time ago you wrote an article about choosing good quests. How does that relate to folks considering this sector?
Yeah, I think the key with choosing good quests is that, there's like all these different versions that people can spin it. And, the most surprising thing to me in the weeks after that article came out and people were just randomly coming up to me talking about it is that the human brain is fascinating. Like we can convince ourselves of anything. And so human psychology is, you read the article and you say, how is what I'm doing a good quest? And then you construct the narrative around that question. And so I would have people come up to me being like, I'm building an NFT company, and I was so inspired by your article. Like the quest that I'm on is so good. And so I think I actually probably asked the wrong question. I think the question is, how is what you're doing a bad quest? How is what you're doing not a good quest? And you should come up with answers that, even if you're like totally convinced that you're doing a thing that is advancing humanity and is important and mission aligned with some like core ideology that you hold, you should still have an answer to how is what I'm doing not a good quest. And for some people, that might be there might be strong enough answers to that question that they decide, you know what, I shouldn't be doing this. This is like not a good use of my time. It's not a good use of the people's time that I'm recruiting. There are better things that we could be doing that have more of an impact, that are going to keep me motivated for a longer period of time. From a macro sense, like after this hype cycle passes, like, am I really going to care about this thing that I did just because it was popular in the moment? So I would just encourage people to, approach it from that slightly more pessimistic viewpoint. And also read the article if you haven't already. I think it's like, it's still true. It's maybe true on different vectors than it was in November of 22 when it first came out, but still relevant, I think.
Trae Stevens, thank you so much for joining us on the Defense Tech Underground.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you guys inviting me to be here. I am incredibly bullish about, what's happening in the tech community around defense tech, and always grateful for the Hoover Institute and how much they've poured into this community as well.
Thanks again for joining us on the Defense Tech Underground podcast. The Defense Tech Underground is dedicated to highlighting the intersection of technology and national security. We bring you conversations with leaders in defense tech and national security innovation.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a rating wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. It helps new listeners find us. And one last note. What you heard on the podcast today reflects the views of the participants and does not represent those of the Defense Tech Underground, the Gordian Knot Center, or Stanford University.
Please be sure to subscribe to the Defense Tech Underground so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.